So I'd like to introduce the moderator for the Impacts on Economic Revitalization, Trends, Strategies, and Resources. She is Jill Casey, the Senior Community Planning and Development Representative, Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator for U.S. HUD in Buffalo. And our relationship with Jill goes back several years. I'm trying to remember, it's at 2014, 2015, somewhere back in there. We met, I think you reached out to Cardi, and we had a conference together, and we've, Jill really, I think, epitomizes the interest in bringing that policy and practice to research and having that dialogue there. So she's been involved in several of our community development institutes. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming back after lunch. We were a little nervous after the last presentation that everyone would throw up their hands and decide we can't solve any problems in a community in the next 2 days and not want to come back. So our panel's grateful to you all for getting a little sustenance and continuing the fight. So we are going to cover economic development in terms of how to revitalize communities. We are going to do that from the perspective of demography and data to actual planning and implementation. We have 3 great presenters to do that. And I think a couple things. Is anyone else in the room a state or federal funder? So there's no, I'm the only representative of a funder in the room, and I think that's noteworthy in that, one, HUD's in it with you. So if you read the color of law, which sort of puts us in a terrible light, we atone most mornings in our office for the past sins of FHA loans, but invite your federal funders to your discussions, not just your ribbon cuttings. I think it's a critical part of it because policy gets set with money. Right? So money is its own world, we learned that, but it also influences how policies are set. And so without inviting the people who pass out resources to help understand the problems you're trying to solve, it's really, really, we work in a vacuum otherwise. So make us part of the discussion as you're doing that. And in this one, I think even as we were preparing for today, the conversation of really what is economic development, I think we define it differently in every community, maybe in every neighborhood, certainly in every industry. And we want to talk a little bit about what we think that is happening in some of the communities around economic development, and then engage you all in that as well. So I am happy to introduce Russell Weaver. He's an economic geographer with the Cornell, no, that's a hard one, right? Should have had something else for lunch. He is with the Cornell IRL office in Buffalo, so we're neighbors who just met today. And Russell is going to share his presentation from economic decline to resurgence.
All right, so first talk after lunch, you get a data analyst with a monotone voice. So for those of you looking for a nap, I've got you covered. But to play a bit on some themes that we've already heard about today, and certainly what Jill was just saying, economic development is something that has different definitions depending on different contexts. And the theme of this session, economic revitalization, goes along with that discussion. Revitalization is sort of a loaded term that means different things to the people using and defining that term. And so I'm going to use an example, a data-driven example from Buffalo today to talk about revitalization, the narrative around it, and some of the challenges that we still face, despite a lot of noteworthy progress that has been made in the city in recent years. So before I get started, I just want to start off with some definitions. And I know I told you I was going to bore you, right? So the definitions that I want to talk a little bit about are when we use the term revitalization or economic revitalization, often the focus of that term is on the number of jobs we create, how well the housing market is doing. And so we look at some of those aggregate big scale indices, and that usually implies what economists often call growth, right? Growth is a quantitative increase in something. It's something getting bigger, and on the opposite side, like the populations we've heard about from demographers earlier today, shrinkage is population getting smaller. So that's a numerical change in something. Whereas development or decline, that's more qualitative in nature. That's thinking about how, whether it's growth or just any sort of change happening inside of a community or region, is actually affecting the folks within that region and the institutions and entities within that region. Right? And so when we talk about revitalization, if we skew the conversation just toward growth and those numerical metrics, we might be missing out on the qualitative changes that are taking place and understanding the relationship that those changes are having with the folks inside of neighborhoods and communities. So that's one of the lenses that I'm going to try to cast as we talk a little bit about housing and jobs numbers in Buffalo. The one thing that I'll say about these processes is while I try to discretize them and give them individual definitions, is that certainly they're interactive and interrelated, and they're characterized by feedback effects. And so one of the challenges that community development practitioners have is in managing those feedback effects and ensuring that where we're making change at different intervention points is feeding back to the rest of the system in a way that's improving not just quantity and growth, but also quality and development. So with that being said, again, this focus on growth isn't something that's just the result of city policies or city priorities or anything like that. Growth is institutionalized in most of our minds, right? That's when we open the paper and we want to know how the economy is doing. We look to see whether the stock market has gone up, whether the number of jobs being created in a given quarter is higher than it was during the quarter before or during the same quarter last year. We have this image that growth is good. Growth is inextricably good, and that's what we want, right? We're after growth. And that leads us to policymaking. A great writer from the city of Rochester recently looked at a piece on trying to attract Amazon's HQ2 into different cities and said that it's really characterized by employment desperation and this drive for growth. That in cities that have seen their population fall in half over the past 50 years, right, they're just desperate for any types of jobs. So they're focused, again, on those numbers and those quantities. So we're looking to see growth in the number of jobs in a particular region. And so when that's the case, right, we tend to take an entire story and repackage it different or sell it in a different way. And so when we see those numbers increasing, rather than focusing on maybe the quality of the jobs that would come from Amazon's HQ2 or the quality of jobs that might come from a $46 million subsidized Bass Pro on your waterfront, right, rather than thinking about that, we see that there's an increase in the number of jobs, and so we're happy. And that's how we get to these narratives of revitalization or resurgence. It's not always bad. Right? But it creates an image that's aggregate in nature. And so this is theme 2 that I want to present to you, this notion of spatial inequality. That when we tell those stories by looking at those aggregate metrics, we engage in, and I'm going to give you a very jargony geographic term here. It's something called the modifiable aerial unit problem. Right? You'll never repeat that again in your life, I'm sure. But what that means is that we can look at data, the exact same data, and tell 2 completely different stories about it, depending on the unit of analysis. And so when we average over the number of jobs that we're creating, or the housing market and how much housing prices have increased, we're saying that for a city or a region, it's booming, it's resurgent, it's revitalized, everything's perfect, wipe your hands, pat yourself on the back, the day is done. But when we do that, we ignore how the same data might tell a completely different story at the neighborhood scale. And so I'm going to try to use that lens to show you Buffalo's growth and revitalization. And again, yes, there's a whole lot of progress going on in Buffalo right now, a lot of positive changes, but that's not to say that when we tell that aggregate story, that everyone in individual neighborhoods inside of the city is feeling that story, right? So headlines like this have dominated the Buffalo narrative for about the past 5, 6, maybe even 10 years, that the city is resurgent, it's coming back. Buffalo is back in a big way. And again, it's hard to argue with some of the aggregate metrics there. Buffalo and some of the developments that have happened in it are becoming models for other upstate cities. One of the big stories that we hear, and one of the big things that we can hang our hat on in this resurgence, is that all of a sudden we have a very hot housing market. So maybe despite all of the vacancies and abandoned properties that we've been hearing about that are a scourge in all upstate cities, we have this narrative now that Buffalo's housing market is hotter than ever. That it's one location, it's of 12 cities in a top 12 list from walkscore.com, it's where you can live affordably in a walkable neighborhood. So it's every urbanist's dream at this point in time. Right? And so that's a narrative that's aggregate in nature. It's telling a story about the whole city. But when you break that down, we start to ask questions, for whom is the city resurgent? Where is that true? If we're out on the ground and our community development organizations are seeing all of this blight and all of these vacant and abandoned properties, where does this narrative of a hot housing market fit in there? How does it interact with that particular story? And so this is, again, using the exact same data that went into that walk score ranking system that you just saw, looking at where walkability can be measured. And so there are 4 different colors here. I won't get into all of it. It's what's called a spatial cross-correlation analysis, but it's looking at where folks have, at a block group level, walkable access to amenities and where they have access to vehicles. And so where you see shades of red, that's showing that, yes, walkability is strong here. You can walk to a lot of different places from these locations. Where you see shades of blue, that's where you don't really have that access, where you have a cold spot or a dearth of amenities that you can walk to. The different shading on that is also showing you where people have high access to vehicles. And so there are some neighborhoods, especially on the east side of the city, that lack any destinations to walk to, really meaningful destinations to walk to, and they also don't have strong access to automobiles. So in this city where it's affordable to live in a walkable location, where it's making this top 10 list in a national narrative, you certainly have instances of spatial inequality, where you have neighborhoods where that's certainly not true. When we look at the housing market, so this is just a regional index that looks at the price for a typical housing unit at the block group scale, as well as the demand for it, the sales volume per single family residential homes. Inside of the city of Buffalo, where you have this hot housing market, it's largely in some of those more walkable areas that have historically been strong neighborhoods, where you still have relatively low prices in large swaths of the city, in addition to relatively low demand, at least at market rate prices. And so again, this idea that you can live affordably in Buffalo, maybe you can live affordably in areas where the housing market hasn't boomed, where these prices are still low, but you're also in these spaces that maybe aren't as walkable. And so that larger narrative might break down slightly. And so this isn't to denigrate anything that's going on in the city of Buffalo, right? We're responding to market forces. It's just to say that by trying to control that narrative and tell a story that an entire city or region is revitalizing, we might get blind spots in practice to some of these lingering issues. And so all I'm trying to do is bring some of these blind spots to the forefront so that we can engage with them in a conversation about how do we deal with some of these lingering problems. Perhaps the biggest one that you heard our first speaker today address is that inside of the city, again, despite these surging housing prices that are even taking some of those less walkable cold spot areas with them, that housing values are still increasing in those areas because of that aggregate narrative and the fact that housing prices are based on comparables. And so if a house is selling just a mile away for $100,000 more than it might have 10 years ago, that's still going to affect what the property that might be worth $40,000 on the east side of Buffalo is going to sell for. So those are spatial relationships that definitely matter. And so while housing prices are skyrocketing and housing costs are going up, the poverty situation in the city hasn't gotten much better. 3 out of every 10 residents in the city are still below the federal poverty line. What these forces tend to do spatially, from a spatial perspective, is segregates the population even more. So the city, since at least 1970, has been seeing lower and lower levels of racial segregation inside of residential communities. For the first time, in terms of decennial censuses, that number is starting to tick back up. We're seeing an increase in segregation. These are 2 group indices, so they're usually not useful. So I like to present a different sort of an index. It's called a diversity index, where basically this represents the probability that 2 people in a place are going to be of different racial or ethnic groups whenever you interact. And so the aggregate numbers, looking at the city of Buffalo, that probability is really high based on the racial and ethnic composition of the city. That probability is about 66%. But when you look at that at a census tract scale and you average over all the census tracts, the average diversity in any neighborhood, if you want to call a census tract a neighborhood, is 43%, right? So there's a big gap there. And for the first time again, that gap has been narrowing over the past few decades, but now it's increasing. And partially the housing market is to blame here, right? It's the differences in housing prices, how you're seeing these vast differences in where they're skyrocketing and where they're staying flat or even ticking up, whether or not the house is increasing in value that way. It's leading to these patterns that we see in socioeconomic status as well. So the last thing that I'll get into, I have a few slides on it, so don't think that this is the last one. I apologize for the misleading statements. But the other number that we look at is not just the housing market and how fast homes are appreciating, but it's also the job market and where jobs are being created. Right, so to try to put this growth in context, again, job growth has been occurring in Buffalo. And so just over the past 5 years, I went and grabbed some data from the Census Bureau from the Local Employment Household Dynamics Survey. It just released brand new data back in August, so I was really excited about that. But we can use that data to monitor what types of jobs are being created in the city, where they're being created, and if they're contributing to what we might think as equitable growth. Right, so growth and shrinkage, like I already said, are a continuum. We can think about quantitative numerical increases or decreases in those values. Development and decline, that's the million-dollar question, right? How do we answer that question of whether or not the jobs that we're creating are more equitable in nature than in previous years, let's say? Right, so I don't have a great answer to that question, but what I can do is summarize some data for you from this survey. There are ways to break down job creation data by the wages that they pay, so how much you can earn, by the types of folks that they're going to, so race, ethnicity, whether or not they're going to folks that actually live in the neighborhood where they're being created, and then we can break down jobs by firm size. And so I just chose these variables because they're available in the data set and because there's empirical literature that would suggest that, for example, small businesses are more rooted locally than a branch of a national firm or something like that. And so if we just add these up on a brief scorecard, I will give you a warning here that I'm using administrative definitions of neighborhoods, so folks on the ground might not agree with some of those definitions, but that's something to take up with planners down the road, right? So aggregating all of that over into Buffalo's neighborhoods, we could quantify, at least in this pilot respect, where equitable growth is happening, where we see jobs going to persons of color more so than not, where we see jobs paying higher wages, where jobs are being created for people in that community. And so just looking at that simple index, we see a lot of variability across the city. And so I've flagged a couple of things. So there are two neighborhoods that score perfectly on that scorecard, but one of them I'll warn you about. That's where a lot of innovation is happening in Buffalo. That's where our medical campus is. And so while all of those criteria that I laid out in my scorecard are checked off here, and so it looks like everything is all well and good, there has been ethnographic literature and research done here suggesting that growth might not be benefiting the local community members. So that's just to tell you that the method that I use is, of course, imperfect. Right, so it's always about reconciling what folks actually interpret growth to be on the ground with what the data suggests. But in this way, what I'm trying to do is present just a case of categorizing, or at least casting a different lens on some of those aggregate stories and aggregate numbers. So the last thing that I'll do here is, if you look at all of those neighborhoods and how they changed, I just tried to look at where growth was correlated with or happening simultaneously with decreases in racial wealth gaps, or in this case, unemployment and poverty gaps. And the data are mixed, right? So there's no clear-cut solution here. There's no silver bullet solution. And that's what I want to emphasize in this last graph. And so as a data analyst, I'll say never do this, right? I'm intentionally trying to draw your eyes to something here. So this isn't the way to go, right? But if you follow my little Microsoft Paint drawings here that I learned how to do when I was like 6 years old, right? And look at the general relationships between job growth and these equitable indicators that I'm advocating for, what we see is almost this bell-shaped type of a curve around zero. And I'm not saying that we need to turn the faucet off and never create jobs, right? But where we see very extreme changes in jobs, whether it's growth or decline, we see less checkboxes for these equitable growth indicators. And so why I'm bringing that up is because we often do run to the Amazon HQ2s of the world and think about what we can give them to bring 1,000 jobs to a particular neighborhood, without thinking about how that 1,000 jobs is a pretty big shock to the system. And we might not be able to manage that large of growth in a way that's benefiting the local community. And so that's what this graph is kind of highlighting with my, again, intentionally misleading lines here. So big takeaways, right? When we try to tell this narrative, growth doesn't equal development, but more so, growth isn't something that applies universally, or revitalization isn't something that applies universally to a study area. Right? We have these data aggregation problems that exist in these stories. And if we're too focused on if our outcome for funding that we're receiving is that we need to create X number of jobs, and we do that, and then we just walk away from it and say we got our money, we did our reporting back to the funder, we received or realized the outcome that we suggested, we're done. We might not have actually done the best job that we could have with trying to bring more equitable growth to a particular area. And so the final point here for practice is that monitoring is key. Without actually diving into some of these metrics and looking at the numbers in a less aggregate fashion, we're again doing maybe ourselves a disservice in promoting the vision for a community or a region that we're trying to promote. So that's all I've got for you. I apologize again for being the data analyst right after lunch, but you can wake up from your nap now and hear from good speakers.